Sergeant Devereux's boot caught the edge of Harlow's gear bag and sent it sliding across the wet tarmac, her spotting scope clattering out onto the gravel like something disposable. He didn't look back. Nobody did. That was the first morning of the Northern Reach exercise, a joint Ranger MARSOC evaluation held every 18 months at CFB Wainwright, Alberta, a flat and brutal stretch of Canadian prairie that in October feels like the inside of a freezer that someone has also managed to make miserable. The wind comes off the plains with nothing to slow it down. The ground freezes shallow and then thaws just enough to become mud. It is not a place that forgives mistakes, and it is not a place that wastes time pretending things are other than what they are. Corporal Yael Harlow understood this. She had been in the Army long enough to stop expecting things to be fair, and she had been assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment long enough to know that fair wasn't really the point. The point was whether you could do the job. She believed she could. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how much energy would be spent convincing other people of that before she ever got the chance to prove it. She picked up the spotting scope, checked the reticle, replaced it in the bag. Then she shouldered everything. Her own pack, which weighed 41 pounds without ammunition, and the additional load-bearing equipment she'd been assigned as the junior member of Team 3, and she followed the others into the briefing tent without saying a word. The team lead for Northern Reach Cycle 7 was Staff Sergeant Devereux, a 12-year Ranger from Louisiana who was universally regarded as one of the finest land navigators in the regiment and who had opinions about everything. He had opinions about rations and about bootlace techniques and about the correct way to establish a hide position in alpine terrain. He had opinions about women in combat roles that he expressed not through argument. He wasn't interested in argument, but through the particular quality of his silence whenever Harlow contributed something to a planning discussion. It was a practiced silence, calibrated, the kind that doesn't require words because it communicates everything it needs to through timing alone. Harlow had been taking notes on it for 3 months. The rest of Team 3 was Monroe, who was 26 and from Manitoba, and who was generally decent to her in the transactional way of someone who neither supports nor opposes something and simply wants to avoid drama. Petrov, who was older and quieter and who had served 2 tours in Kandahar, and who sometimes looked at Harlow with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostility, not warmth, just something watchful and reserved. And Thibault, who was 24 and who had never deployed and who followed Devereux's lead in most things the way a compass follows north. 4 people and 1 objective, a 5-day live fire evaluation across 40 kilometers of broken terrain, culminating in a precision engagement exercise at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, assessed by a joint evaluation board that included Canadian Forces observers and 2 senior MARSOC instructors who had come up from Lejeune. Harlow was the designated marksman for Team 3. This had not been a popular assignment. The objection, when it came, was phrased carefully. Devereux raised it during the pre-exercise equipment check on day 1, in front of everyone, in the tone of someone raising a legitimate operational concern rather than a personal grievance. "I want it on record," he said, not looking at her, "that I requested a different asset for the DM slot. That request was denied. I'm not here to relitigate that. I'm here to complete the mission. But if the board asks, I want it understood that this was not my configuration." Monroe studied his boots. Thibault nodded, like this was reasonable. Petrov said nothing. Harlow said, "Understood, Staff Sergeant." She said it, the way she said most things in those situations, neutrally, with no inflection that could be characterized as either submission or defiance. She had learned that both those things were traps. Submission invited more of the same. Defiance invited a different category of problem, one involving words like attitude and not a team player. And those words had weight in evaluation files that outlasted any single exercise. Neutral was its own form of discipline. She had been practicing it for years. The terrain at Wainwright in October is not technically hostile, but it operates on a logic that punishes inattention with a consistency that hostile terrain sometimes doesn't. It doesn't change on you. It is simply cold and exposed and honest. The prairie doesn't hide what it's doing. The wind is exactly as bad as you can see it being from a distance. The mud is exactly as deep as it looks. There is something clarifying about an environment that doesn't pretend. Harlow found in those first 2 days that she was moving well. Her field craft was tight. She'd spent 2 seasons working with a precision shooting coach in Colorado before her Ranger assessment, and the movement discipline that comes with that work. The patience, the attention to environmental variables, had translated into a kind of stillness that the others hadn't quite developed yet. She took longer to sight in. She made more adjustments. She asked more questions of herself before committing to a position. Devereux called this hesitation. He said it on the second afternoon, during a halt in a tree line near the exercise's midpoint checkpoint, when Harlow was taking an additional 2 minutes to range a target, and he was watching the clock. "Harlow, you're holding us up. I'm ranging the secondary target, Staff Sergeant. The wind shifted 14 minutes ago. I want to recompute the solution before we move. We have a solution. We've had a solution for 6 minutes. That solution was computed before the wind shifted." There was a pause. It was a specific kind of pause. The kind where the person being corrected has to decide whether the correction is a challenge to their authority or a legitimate piece of information. Devereux had been in the Army long enough to know the difference, but knowing the difference and acting on it are two different things, especially in front of an audience. "We're moving in 90 seconds, he said. She completed her computation in 83. That night, in the shared billet area, a canvas shelter with cots and a diesel heater that worked about 70% of the time, she heard Thibault talking to Monroe in the low voice people use when they believe they're being quiet but aren't. "She's going to get us a subpar score on the engagement phase. Maybe." Monroe sounded unconvinced. "She's slow. She's methodical. Same thing out there." Monroe didn't say anything to that. Harlow lay in her sleeping bag and looked at the ceiling of the shelter and did the thing she had taught herself to do in these situations, which was to take the information as data rather than as injury. Someone thought she was slow. That was a perception. Perceptions were addressable. You address them through outcomes, not through conversation. Because conversation produced words and words evaporated. But outcomes sat in a file somewhere, and they did not evaporate. She thought about the wind readings she'd taken that afternoon. She thought about the target she'd ranged and the solution she'd computed. She thought about the 2 minutes Devereux had called hesitation. Then she went to sleep. On the third day, the exercise introduced a complication. The evaluation board, in the way of evaluation boards, had decided to add a variable that hadn't been in the original brief. A timed engagement scenario at 1,100 meters in diminished visibility, wind from the northwest at 12 knots with gusts at 18, moving targets, 2-minute engagement window per shooter. It was the kind of scenario designed to find the limits of a skill set rather than confirm the easy parts of it. Devereux went first. He shot well, clean, efficient, consistent. He engaged 3 of 4 targets in the time window and his solution was sound. The evaluation board made notes. Monroe went second, 2 out of 4. The wind had shifted slightly during his engagement, and he hadn't caught it early enough. Petrov went third, 3 out of 4. His solution was solid, but his second shot showed a correction that came a half-second late. Then it was Harlow. She had been watching all 3 of them. Not their technique, she'd assessed that already, but the environment. The way the grass at 400 meters was bending. The way the tree line on the left edge was moving compared to the tree line on the right. The way the targets themselves, metal silhouettes on cable systems, were tracking slightly downrange in the gusts, which meant that their actual position during the engagement window would be a half-meter to the east of their start position, and any shooter who didn't account for that was going to shoot a half-meter left of where they should be shooting. She settled in. The evaluation board member with the radio said, "Harlow, your window opens in 5, 4, 3. She exhaled. The first shot was a hit. The second shot was a hit. The third shot was a hit. The fourth shot, taken with 12 seconds remaining in the window, after a gust that pushed the target almost a full meter before it settled, was a hit. 4 for 4. There was a silence from the evaluation board that was different from the silence that had followed the other 3 shooters. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence that was doing something. One of the MARSOC instructors, a man named Vreeland, who had not spoken once during the previous 3 engagements, said, "Run it back." They reviewed the footage from the range cameras. The 4 hits registered in the log. Vreeland said something quietly to the Canadian Forces observer beside him. The Canadian Forces observer made a longer note than he'd made after anyone else. Harlow cleared her rifle, applied the safety, and waited. Devereux was standing 8 meters away. She could see the back of his neck. She did not look for a reaction. She had learned that looking for reactions was its own form of wanting something from people and wanting things from people who were determined not to give them, was a way of giving them power they hadn't earned. She kept her eyes on the target line. She kept her breathing steady. That evening, Petrov came and sat beside her at the field kitchen, without being invited and without preamble. "You read the wind off the grass bend at 400 meters, he said. "It wasn't a question, and the cable tension on the target system," she said. "They run loose in high wind. The target shifts east. I saw the first shift. I didn't account for the second. It was subtle." "You weren't subtle about the correction." She looked at him. He was watching the horizon with the expression she still couldn't fully categorize. Not admiration, not deference, but something more like recognition. The way one person looks at another person who has been doing something correctly in conditions where doing it correctly is not obvious. "Your Kandahar tour," she said. "Second one. You were the DM for your team?" "Yes." "What range?" Longest confirmed was 980. Average engagement was closer to 600. Different problem set than today. "Different problem set than today," he agreed. He paused. "You recomputed the solution on day 2. In the tree line. When Devereux called you slow?" "Yes, you were right. I know." Another pause. The diesel heater in the kitchen tent was cycling on and off. Somewhere out on the range, the evaluation board's vehicle was moving. Headlights visible through the tree line, red taillights, disappearing, and then reappearing between stands of poplar. "He's not a bad team lead," Petrov said. "I know that too. He just doesn't." He stopped, started again. "He has a template, what a DM is supposed to look like. You don't match the template. I'm aware. The problem is the template is wrong and he can't see it yet." She didn't say anything. She had thought exactly this more than once, in more or less those words. There was something almost disorienting about hearing it said out loud by someone else, in the matter-of-fact tone Petrov used, as though it were an operational observation rather than a personal vindication. "He'll see it," Petrov said. "He said it the way you say something you're not entirely sure of, but are willing to assert anyway. Because sometimes assertion is the right tool." Then he stood up and walked back toward the billet area, and Harlow sat by the field kitchen and finished her coffee and watched the evaluation board's headlights move through the poplar stand until they disappeared. Day 4 was movement. 40 kilometers across the training area with full load, not a speed march, but a sustained movement with route-finding requirements, contingency engagements built into the course, and 2 mandatory halt and assess phases, where the evaluation board could introduce additional requirements. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the ground that had been mud was now a thin crust of frost over mud, which meant it held your weight for half a step, and then didn't, and the footing was unpredictable in a way that drained energy faster than simple difficult ground. Harlow had done this before. She had done longer with more weight. What she hadn't done in those previous iterations was do it as the person everyone was watching. Not for the usual reasons teams watch their DMs, which is because a designated marksman is a precision asset and precision assets require protection, but for the other reason, the one nobody says out loud, which is that if she fell apart on the movement phase, it would confirm something that several members of the team had already decided they believed. She knew this. She used it, not as anger. Anger was fuel that burned hot and left you depleted at the wrong moments. She used it as information, as a constant reminder of exactly what was at stake, which had the effect of making her more precise, more deliberate, more attentive to the small decisions that the long movement phases were full of. The angle of her footfall on the frost crust, the distribution of her pack weight across the hip belt versus the shoulder straps, the timing of her water intake, the rate at which she was burning through her glycogen stores versus her fat reserves, and what that meant for her energy availability in hour 6 versus hour 3. She was a systems thinker. The Army had given her that, but the competitive shooting had refined it. Precision shooting at long range is fundamentally a problem of managing variables. And the variables are never only ballistic. They are physiological and environmental and psychological. And the shooters who understand that are different from the shooters who don't in ways that compound over time. By the 18-kilometer mark, Thibault was struggling. He wasn't falling behind. He had the fitness for it, but he was fighting the ground rather than working with it, taking each slick patch as a problem to be overcome through force rather than technique, and that approach was costing him. His knee had turned twice on the frost crust. He was compensating in his gait. He hadn't said anything. Harlow moved up beside him at a natural slow point in the route. "Change your footfall angle," she said quietly. "Land flatter. Let the crust take a split second to fail before you commit your weight. He looked at her. He looked like he wanted to argue, or ask why she was talking to him, or say something that placed him at a remove from having to accept advice from her. But his knee had turned twice, and he was 17 kilometers from the end, and he was smart enough to know when being stubborn was also being stupid. He changed his footfall. He didn't thank her. That was fine. She hadn't said it for the thanks. They made the final checkpoint at 13:47 hours. The evaluation board's primary observer checked their time against the standard and made a note in his ledger. They were 4 minutes ahead of the benchmark. Devereux called the halt. He did the equipment check without speaking much. Then he went to report to the board and came back 10 minutes later and stood at the edge of the team's rest position and looked at something in the middle distance for a while before he spoke. Final engagement phase is Zoo 600 tomorrow, he said. Single shooter, Team DM. Evaluation board selects the conditions at 5:45, no preview. Everyone knew this was the last scored event. Everyone knew what was at stake. He looked at Harlow. It was not the look of someone who had changed his mind. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of changing it and not yet sure whether they're going to step forward or back. I need to know your zero is current, he said. I confirmed it this morning before the movement phase, she said. It's current. A pause. Any adjustments from the day's conditions? I logged 2. Temperature drop affects the load about 4 FPS. The barometric reading I took at 1600 suggests we'll have a pressure shift by morning. I've computed the adjusted solution. Another pause, longer. Show me, he said. She showed him. She walked him through the data card, the environmental log, the ballistic solution, the contingency adjustments for the wind directions most likely given the forecast. He followed it. He didn't say it was good, but he didn't ask her to explain any of it twice. And a man who doesn't believe in what you're showing him asks you to explain things twice. He handed the data card back. 0545, he said. Be ready. She didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety, or not only from that, but because the mind that had spent 3 months taking notes on every variable in her environment was still running, still cataloging, still running probability assessments on tomorrow's conditions. This was something she had come to accept about herself. The same mental architecture that made her useful in the field made rest a composition on the night before something that mattered. She thought about her mother, who had been a distance runner and who had told her once that the races she'd run best were the ones where she'd stopped trying to predict the outcome and had simply committed to running exactly as well as she knew how to run, and then found out what that was worth. Her mother had said this in the kitchen of their house in Petawawa, sitting across the table with a cup of tea, the way she said most important things, not as advice, just as information, just as a thing that was true and that Harlow might find useful to know. Her mother had died in her 2nd year of basic training, a medical thing, sudden and wrong, and without warning, the way those things always are, when they happen to people who should have had more time. Harlow had finished basic. She had not allowed herself to process what that cost until much later, and she was not sure she had processed all of it yet. What she had taken from it, and from everything that came after it, was this: that the question was never whether things were fair. The question was whether you were going to do what you were capable of doing. And the answer to that was always yes, because the answer to that was the only thing you actually controlled. She closed her eyes at 0230. She was awake at 0500 without an alarm. The evaluation board selected conditions at 0545, 1,150 meters. Wind from the northwest at 9 knots, variable. 2 target arrays, 3 targets each. First array stationary, second array moving at 5 kilometers per hour laterally. Engagement window, 90 seconds per array. 3 minutes total, to put 6 rounds on target. Harlow listened to the conditions readout. She made 3 adjustments to her prepared solution on the data card while the evaluation board member was still talking. When he finished, she asked one question: what's the lateral travel rate on the moving targets? Constant or variable? The board member looked at his notes. Constant at 5K. Thank you. She adjusted once more. Devereux was standing 4 meters to her right. She was aware of him without looking at him. She was aware of Petrov behind her and Monroe beyond him and Thibault at the edge of her peripheral vision. She was aware of the 2 Marsasic instructors from Lejeune, both of whom had made longer notes on their clipboards after the previous day's 4-for-4 engagement. She was aware of the Canadian Forces observer, who had been quiet and precise and who wrote things down with the kind of care that suggested the things he wrote down mattered. She was aware of all of it. She set it aside. The frozen ground was hard under her elbows. The rifle, a C-14 Timberwolf, which was a weapon she had trained on for 14 months and knew in the way you know something when you have spent that many hours with it, settled into her grip the way it always did, the way that felt less like holding a tool and more like a completion of a posture her body had memorized. The first array, stationary. She worked left to right. 1, hit, 2, hit, 3. A gust at 12 knots, 2-second duration she held. The gust passed, she completed her breath. 3, hit, 41 seconds on the first array. She tracked to the second. The moving targets were transiting right to left at their constant rate, caves visible in the early light, the silhouette swinging slightly in the residual wind. She computed the lead, applied it. 4, hit, 5, hit, 6. The gust again, the same gust pattern as the previous day, northwest origin, intermittent, predictable once you'd watched it long enough. She waited 3 seconds. It passed. 6, hit, 90 seconds. 6 rounds, 6 hits. She applied the safety and did not move for a moment. The target line was quiet. The grass at 400 meters was bending. Behind her, she heard one of the MARSOC instructors. She thought it was Vreeland, the one who had asked them to run back the footage the previous day, make a short sound. Not words, just a sound. The kind that isn't a reaction you decide to have. The Canadian Forces observer wrote something on his clipboard. Devereux said nothing. The debrief was at 1400. The evaluation board walked through each scored event, each team, each individual result. When they reached the Team 3 DM results, the lead evaluator paused on Harlow's engagement record. 2 days, 10 rounds fired in scored conditions, 10 hits, and said in the tone of someone reading a number that requires no embellishment, "That's a clean card." Nobody said anything. Then Vreeland said from the back of the room, "Corporal Harlow, your data card for the final engagement. The adjustment you made for the moving target lead, you accounted for the gust interval." "Yes, sir." "How?" "I observed the wind pattern for 3 days. Same origin, same interval. I logged it." A pause. "You logged it before the board announced the conditions." "I logged it before the board announced the conditions." Vreeland looked at the other MARSOC instructor. Something passed between them that Harlow observed but did not interpret. Then Vreeland looked back at her. "That kind of prep doesn't make it into most range reports," he said. "It didn't make it into mine either," she said. "I didn't include it because it was preparation, not execution. The execution is what you score." Another pause. "That's an interesting distinction. It's the one that matters in the field, sir." Afterward, outside the debrief building, in the cold that had settled back over the Alberta prairie like it had never left, Devereux found her at the vehicle line where she was breaking down her kit. He stood there for a moment. The wind was doing what it did. "The gust interval," he said. "You knew it before the engagement." "Yes, that's not in any standard preparation protocol." "No, you developed it on your own, over 3 days, yes." He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't the silence he'd used before, the calibrated one, the one that communicated without words. This was a different kind, less certain. The silence of someone reassessing something they thought they understood. "The data card on day 2, he said. "In the tree line, you were right." She didn't say anything. "I called you slow. Yes, that was wrong." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her, the way people sometimes look when they're saying something that costs them something. She understood the cost. She didn't need him to look at her for the statement to be real. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she said. "Don't thank me for being accurate," he said. He said it roughly, the way someone says something when they're still irritated. Not at her, she understood now, but at themselves. Then he picked up his own kit and walked toward the vehicle. Petrov came past a moment later. He didn't stop. He glanced at her with that unreadable expression, and this time she read it correctly. It was the look of someone who had said something was going to happen and was noting, without satisfaction, that it had. The joint evaluation results were posted 30 days later. Team 3 placed first overall in the Northern Reach cycle. Harlow's individual marksmanship score was the highest recorded in the exercise that year. The Canadian Forces Observers Report, portions of which were shared with the regiment as part of the post-exercise review, noted in its conclusion that the designated marksman for Team 3 had demonstrated what the report called an environmental situational awareness that significantly exceeded the evaluation standard, suggesting a preparation methodology worth examining for broader integration. Devereux read this report. She knew he read it because he sent her a message through the unit's internal system 2 days after it circulated. The message said, "The prep methodology. Write it up. I want to include it in the team's lessons learned file." She wrote it up. She kept it precise and impersonal, the way good operational documentation is written. No explanation of where the methodology came from, or why she developed it, or what it had taken to apply it in conditions where no one expected it to be applied. Just the method, just the steps, just the thing that worked. That was enough. That had always been enough. She filed it and went back to work. Outside the window, Alberta was still cold, still flat, still honest. The wind off the prairie bent the grass in long, legible waves. She watched it for a moment. The direction, the interval, the way it moved through the training area, like a system that could be understood, if you were patient enough to watch it long enough. Then she picked up her data card, and she started logging.